From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Should Supreme Court Justices Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas recuse themselves from the cases related to Donald Trump and the 2020 election? That's the political campaign underway as the Supreme Court nears a ruling on Donald Trump's claim of presidential immunity. We'll talk about the political fight that is underway over the court and its decisions. Plus, the territory of Hong Kong, formerly a British colony, now granted autonomy by China, supposedly convicts 14 Democratic activists of violating its national security law. Another reminder of how China has swallowed up that territory, which it had promised would have autonomy for 50 years after 1997. And we'll talk about that with two veterans of Hong Kong, as am I. I'm Paul Gigot, editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal on this Potomac Watch podcast. And I'm here with Colin Levy and Bill McGurn, both of whom lived in Hong Kong, working for the Journal at one time or another. And we all love it a great deal. But let's first talk about the recusal fight. This is taking ugly turns here recently, Colin, as the two senators, Dick Durbin of Illinois, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and the man breathing down his neck, Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, wrote a letter demanding to Chief Justice John Roberts, demanding that the chief meet with them to discuss their recusal demand of Justice Samuel Alito. The chief responded not by writing back, but Samuel Alito responded with a letter stating that he would not recuse himself. What do you make of the Alito response, Colin?
Well, I think it was completely correct that Alito was the one who responded. Again, you have to remember that what the court's code of conduct says, a justice will recuse himself. It doesn't say a justice will be recused by someone else. That's not really the way it works. But look, Paul, I think the most important thing to understand about the conflict at large here is that what we're seeing now with the attacks on Justice Alito and the flags outside his house is really nothing more than a continuation of what has been a years-long campaign to discredit the conservative justices on the Supreme Court, obviously including Justice Clarence Thomas as well. So this is not actually about propriety or ethics or any legal standard of any kind. It's just about politics. It's about using personal attacks on the justices to change the judicial result. And Democrats want the conservative justices to recuse so that they can weaken the conservative majority on the court, which they obviously don't like because it doesn't give them the political outcomes that they want. So short of recusal, basically what happens is if the justices don't recuse, they think they have a win too, because the Democrats then want to be able to say, look, there were demands for recusal and the justice declined to recuse, and therefore any decision that's issued with him in the majority is therefore somehow suspect or illegitimate, and then they hope that they can fundraise off of that. So the whole game here is to undermine the legitimacy of the decisions that are issued by the conservative majority on the court.
Bill, the merits of the senatorial claims relate to the so-called two flags controversy. It was reported recently in the New York Times that Justice Alito's home had flown an upside-down American flag for a period in 2017. Don't ask me why this is being reported so many years later. I think it has something to do with the Supreme Court docket currently, but it was reported that that flag was flown at his home upside down, and then later reported that another flag, the so-called pine tree flag, which includes the statement, an appeal to heaven, was flown out of their second home in, I believe, New Jersey, the justice's second home. And I guess these are supposed to be some kind of symbols of solidarity with Donald Trump's Stop the Steal campaign. Though there's not much evidence of that.
No, I think there's no evidence of it. The Appeal to Liberty to Heaven flag, I think, was a George Washington flag. It was, until recently, was hanging in San Francisco. They took it down after the Alito flap, and said, oh my God. And now we discover it's January 6th, but they clearly didn't know that for a while. It's just an excuse. Look, it's in the pattern of the attacks on Clarence Thomas and his wife, Ginny, the attacks Chuck Schumer made on Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, saying you're going to reap the whirlwind. There's an attack, I think, today in Rolling Stone on Amy Coney Barrett over her husband. I think Alito handled it well. He wrote a letter explaining he has an obligation not to recuse unless he really violates a code. This is a decision made by his wife.
To fly the flags, you mean?
Yeah, to fly the flags. I'm amazed that all these people that supposedly believe in women's rights somehow don't believe Mrs. Alito has a right to whatever opinion she has. And I think it's nothing. As you said, look, the Supreme Court for decades was the Democrats' favorite institution because it was their preferred legislature. All they had to do is get 5 votes to pass whatever they want without the bother of going to voters. And Colin said the conservative majority has changed that. I would argue slightly differently. That's the constitutional majority. Most of these decisions are taking decisions like abortion, as Alito did, and putting it back to the people, to the voters, as they properly should. And the Democrats don't like it.
Let's talk about this recusal standard, because Justice Alito referred to the Supreme Court's Code of Conduct, which includes their standard for recusal and was endorsed by all of the justices, all of the current justices, in a relatively recent statement responding to some of the ethical complaints about the court. And when the court issued a new code of conduct, it included some discussion about recusal. And that standard includes a couple of planks, Colin. One, that a justice, and I'm quoting here, is presumed impartial and has an obligation to sit unless disqualified. Okay. And when should a justice disqualify himself or herself? Only, quote, when the justice's impartiality might reasonably be questioned, that is, where an unbiased and reasonable person who is aware of all relevant circumstances would doubt that the justice could fairly discharge his or her duties, unquote. So the essence of that statement is a unbiased and reasonable person could reach the conclusion that the justice was impartial based on a reading of certain facts. And Justice Alito asserted that that standard of disqualification was not met by these flag cases, and therefore he need not recuse. But leave aside the facts of this case, the important standard here is that the justices make their own decisions on recusal. It's not going to be some outside court or their fellow justices, and that there is a presumption of impartiality unless there are really significant facts that would call it into question.
Yes, and remember, Paul, that was a unanimous statement by all of the justices on the court, and I think it really is notable that that statement talking about a justice's impartiality refers specifically to an unbiased and reasonable person, not just to a reasonable person, because they know that if they use simply a reasonable person standard, that anyone could gin up anything and get it run in a newspaper, and then suddenly that might somehow seem reasonable to someone. Unbiased is a very important word to consider there. And again, as we look at the court, which we all assume is so partisan at all times, I think we have to realize that the more progressive justices on the court have just as much of an interest in this as any of the conservative justices, arguably even more so. The canon of judicial ethics lays out specific standards under which lower court judges should recuse, but the standard of recusal for Supreme Court justices is different for a reason. This is the duty to sit that we talk about. When you think about in the lower courts, a judge stepping off a case, it doesn't matter nearly as much because they can be replaced by another judge. But in the case of the Supreme Court, the 9 justices sit on cases and people don't fill in for them. So the recusal of a justice has an outsized effect on the outcome of a case. So if we allow these headline-grabbing, politicized non-events, like what flags a justice is flying over their beach house, to somehow determine the makeup of the Supreme Court on cases of highest national priority, the entire constitutional system has literally been hijacked by the peanut gallery, and that's just a disaster for the justice system. And I would add here, again, if this is going to be a situation as they're suggesting that somehow Chief Justice Roberts should tell Justice Alito to recuse, or that somehow other justices should get involved in each other's recusal decisions, the liberal justices should want that less than anyone. If this is going to be survivor game to see who gets voted off the island. They know, frankly, on a 6-3 court that they would be the ones that probably should be the most worried about it.
All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk more about this Supreme Court controversy when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot, and I'm here with Colin Levy and Bill McKern. We're talking about the Supreme Court. And Bill, Colin, I think, makes a crucial point about this recusal standard because you have 9 justices, so you can get a ruling 5-4, odd number. If there's constantly a game of who should recuse, what would happen is you'd get these appeals from outside groups, right and left, to say she should recuse, he should recuse. And the whole point would be to try to essentially game which justices can sit on any particular case. So you look at the justices' history, their thinking, and you'd say, aha, I need to get Alito off of that one. So you aim at Alito, or I need to get Sotomayor off of that one. And before you know it, you have essentially a kind of national lobbying campaign, which would be aimed at the justices to embarrass them, humiliate them, suggest somehow that they are unethical if they don't recuse. And then it tarnishes the credibility of the court, number one. But then you'd have this constant fighting over who should recuse. And it would become a fight even maybe within the court, particularly if the justices, as the Democratic senators want, would have to rule on the recusal decisions of other justices.
Yeah, I think this is another example of Democrats, when something gets in their way, they want to change it. You know, we talk about Donald Trump busting norms, name calling, and so forth. It really pales next to Democratic efforts. You know, the Electoral College goes the other way, get rid of the Electoral College. The Senate filibuster on judges goes the wrong way. On Supreme Court justices, get rid of that. And it can backfire because it can be used by the right as well as the left. And if the situation you outlined really does happen, if that becomes an incentive, you can bet that right-wing groups will do it as much as left-wing groups. And what does that mean? That means a wholesale politicization of the court, surrounded by the circus. You know, right now we don't have it. We really don't have people calling for recusal and everything in that kind of orchestrated campaign that you mentioned. But if this becomes a precedent, surely people are going to learn the lesson, and the stakes are high. And if they think they can knock off a deciding vote by mounting a campaign for recusal, they will. So it's a horrible precedent. I assume even the liberal justices on the court recognize that, or I hope they recognize that is a real threat to the court. And that's why I think Samuel Alito's letter was so great. He spelled out in very cold, sober terms what the standard is and why it would be dangerous to give into it. What he means is, I'm not going to give in to the politics of the moment.
Speaking of the politics of the moment, Colin, the backdrop here for the Senate Democrats is the particular campaign that Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island has been running for some time. He's the driving force here behind the hostility to the court and the justices. And he has made threats with some of the other justices in a famous amicus brief in a case that perhaps the court will have to be restructured if it doesn't rule on cases the way he wants. So he has been the driver of these supposed ethical worries, working closely with members of the press. And he's breathing down the neck of Dick Durbin, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And Durbin is going along because he's very concerned that Whitehouse and the junior members of the Judiciary Committee could replace him as chairman if he isn't along for their ride. And there's a precedent for this. Dianne Feinstein was a former senator, now deceased. She was a little too bipartisan for their liking. There was a lot of outside agitation to get rid of her, and finally she was ousted as committee chairman.
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain pleasure in witnessing the progressive on progressive violence playing out here, and there's no question that all of this for each of the senators is coming in the context not just of the presidential election, but of their own political prospects, as we discussed before, regarding their fundraising and their ability to, hype these court cases, especially because of Alito's role in the abortion decision, as something that they can fundraise off of. And I want to loop back to, in that political vein, on something that Bill mentioned earlier, which is an incredibly toxic and disappointing thing to see on the left, which is this double standard here regarding the Democrats' eagerness to attack the wives of Justice Alito and Justice Thomas. You know, in Justice Alito's case, he was clear, and all accounts of the flag story have been clear, that the flags were raised by his wife, by Martha Ann Alito. And in his statement declining to recuse himself from any cases related to this issue, he acknowledged that his wife is an independent, smart human being who has the right to make decisions without him scolding her or telling her what to do. You know, that's not even feminism. That's basic human decency in any marriage. And yet somehow now, when it serves their political ends, Democrats are quite happy to chuck all of that, feminism and common decency, out the window in service of saying that Justice Alito is responsible for his wife's actions. So while we're talking about the politics here and Democrats' prospects, I wonder if all of those Democrats also think that a husband should tell their wives how to vote, what to think, or what flags to raise over their houses.
Colin, in your household, do you have flag waving responsibility?
You want to know the truth? The flag that we raise outside of our house at family gatherings is a joy flag. It just says joy.